The Messerschmitt BF109 is one of the most famous World War II fighters, having seen use before, during and after that conflict in one version or another. Known for being fast and manoeuvrable, it became the backbone of the Luftwaffe's fighter force. Join me in this video as I build and review the Messerschmitt BF109G-6 plastic model kit in 1/72nd scale from Airfix. Hi, I'm Matt and you're watching Model Minutes. Honourable mention to my patrons over on Patreon, thanks for your support. To find out more about becoming a patron and the perks it gets you, take a look at the links in the description. If you're a regular subscriber of my channel, you'll know that I did an unboxing video of this kit not long ago, and in that I addressed some concerns I had with this model. To see an in-depth look at the sprues and contents of the box, take a look at that video. In this one, I'll be focusing on the construction of the kit and seeing what it's like when it's finished. As always, please remember that adult supervision will be required due to the use of sharp tools and toxic paints and chemicals. Airfix recommends this kit to those aged 8 years and older. The first and almost ritualistic step is to wash the plastic components in warm soapy water. This will help remove any dirt or oil left over from the moulding process. A clean plastic part will have a better surface for the paint and cement to stick to. These parts were then left to air dry. I began by removing the fuselage halves, pilot seat and pilot figure from the sprue. Throughout this build I will remove the parts using either a sharp knife or some snips. The leftover plastic or rough areas is then sanded smooth using a nail file or carefully scraped away using the knife. The pilot seat was then cemented into one half of the fuselage, using the locating pins inserted into the correct holes. The pilot figure was then cemented to his chair and test fitted the other fuselage half, making sure the chair was correctly aligned. If it isn't, I will have some problems with fitting the other half of the fuselage later. I'm doing this now as an unpainted plastic surface will bond better. Throughout this build I'll be using Tamiya extra thin cement as it has good flow and bonding properties and is easy to apply with the included brush in the lid of the pot. Humbrol 240 RLM02 grout matte was then thinned with Tamiya acrylic thinner X20A at a rough ratio of about 2 parts paint to 1 part thinner. This will allow the paint to flow better and dry quicker, leaving less visible brush strokes, but will mean a number of layers might be needed. I painted the internal cockpit areas with this paint using a medium brush to get quick and even coverage. I also used this colour on the internal side of the bottom wing as that would be visible in the cockpit. Other areas, including the landing gear doors, bays and radiators, were also given a coat of this paint. Whilst the paint was drying, I removed the 2 halves for the external fuel drop tank, cleaned up the rough areas and cemented them together. They locate together using the pins and holes moulded inside the 2 halves. Extra cement can be run along the seams to help them bond together and pressure is applied until it has set. The propeller assembly comes next. The retaining pin is cemented into the rear of the prop, and you can see me here testing the distance. It is intended that the prop be able to spin freely when installed to the model, so I'm checking that I've pushed the pin in just enough to allow this. Too close and it won't spin, too far and it will droop on the nose and look strange. The spinner can then be added to the front of the propeller and cemented into place. The upper and lower wing surfaces are now cemented together. These fit well with no real issues. They would benefit from being held in place until the cement has cured though. If you'll remember from my unboxing video, extra wing guns are included for the German version. As I was building the Swiss version, I did not require these guns. The only problem was that there were 2 moulded slots in the wings for these guns. I decided to use Humbrol model filler to fill these holes. It was spread onto some card, then using another scrap piece of card was smoothed over the holes to fill them. When the filler has dried, it can be sanded smooth using a nail file or fine sandpaper. The drop tank was then cemented onto its locating pins. This is a fairly simple step, but you must take care that the tank doesn't droop to one side or the other as it is cemented in. Humbrol 242 RLM71 Dunkelgrün matte acrylic was then used straight out of the pot to paint the majority of the pilot. I took care here using a fine paintbrush to avoid placing the paint in any unwanted areas. Humbrol 93 Desert Yellow matte acrylic was used to pick out the pilot's flying helmet. This was then followed by Humbrol 61 Flesh matte acrylic to highlight his face. I also used Humbrol 11 Silver to pick out the glass areas on his goggles. Citadel non-oil acrylic black wash was used on the pilot to highlight the recessed details. This wash saturates the recessed areas, making them look like they are in shadow. I also used this wash on the wheel wells and cockpit floor. The two halves of the fuselage are now cemented together. You must make sure you add the propeller at this stage, and be careful with the placement of your cement so that it spins freely. Cement was run along the seams and the halves held together until they had bonded. The fuselage can then be added to the wings that were previously assembled. They simply slot into place and fit quite well. The tail surfaces can be added next. They are cemented into their respective slots, but again you must take care to ensure they are level and don't droop up or down as the cement cures. The air intake on the bottom of the nose can now be added, simply cementing it into the correct locating holes. This can be a little fiddly, so tweezers might be useful here. The tail wheel is glued into the hole on the tail of the model. Take care here as this part is a little delicate and you don't want to break it as you fix it in place. Next, the air filter on the nose is added. It cements into the slot on the left side of the nose, which I found needed a little cleaning up with a knife to get a good fit. This kit comes with two filters, a normal version and a tropical version. The tropical version was for the previously released issue of this kit, but for this one you'll need the smaller part. You'll notice that I completely didn't realise this and have at this stage cemented the large tropical filter in place. I guess that's what you get for not paying attention to the instructions. I do, however, realise my error, remove that part and install the correct one instead. The landing gear legs come moulded onto the gear covers, and these parts are cemented into the slots in the landing gear bays. The option to display the gear raised is included should you want to though. Again, just take your time here to make sure they are aligned correctly and not hanging to one side or the other. I'm going to leave the wheels off for now and add them later after I've done some painting. Humbrol 247 RLM 76 light blue matte acrylic was then thinned with the Tamiya thinners and applied to the lower and side surfaces of the aircraft using a wide flat brush. A couple of coats would be needed to get a good uniform finish. I do apply it to the upper wing surfaces though to form a base layer for the camouflage pattern. Humbrol 246 RLM 75 grey violet matte was again thinned and then applied to the upper wing and tail surfaces using a wide flat brush. I swapped to a thinner brush and then applied more paint to the top of the fuselage. I applied a mottled effect on the sides of the fuselage by building up layers of this thinned paint. Next, Humbrol 245 RLM 74 grey-green matte acrylic was thinned and then brushed onto the wings and fuselage following the camouflage pattern on the instructions. I did this completely freehand, but if you wanted to get some really straight and defined lines, you could always use some masking tape to help you, but I was quite pleased with how mine came out. I went over some of the mottled areas using this paint to try and give a bit of colour variation. I painted the propeller spinner with a number of thin coats of Humbrol 34 matte white acrylic. Care must be taken here to avoid placing any unwanted paint on the previously painted areas. I used the Humbrol 245 matte paint on the cockpit canopy frames. A fine paintbrush applied the paint straight out of the pot, taking my time to apply it carefully. If I get any paint in the wrong place, it can be gently scraped away using a pointed tool. Humbrol 33 matte black acrylic was then used to paint the wheels whilst they were still on the sprue. I then used the same paint to carefully pick out the tyre on the tail wheel. Humbrol 241 RLM 70 Schwarzgrün matte acrylic was then used to carefully paint the propeller blades and the pattern on the spinner. Again, masking tape could be used to paint the pattern on the spinner, but I had a go freehand and it turned out okay. The wheel hubs were then given a coat of Humbrol 246, which matches the underside of the aircraft. I did this carefully, taking my time to follow the moulded lines on the parts. I then used this silver acrylic paint pen to highlight the landing gear legs from the doors. I did this carefully and found the pen worked quite well. This is a recent addition to my painting equipment and wanted to see how they could be used. The wheels are now carefully cemented onto their locating pins. I applied a small amount of cement and pushed them into place. Tamiya masking tape was now positioned on the model and pushed down to prevent any future coats of paint from seeping under it. I'm marking out the areas on the lower wings and fuselage that are to be painted red in preparation for the Swiss crosses. The instructions do give you measurements for this to follow. Humbrol 153 Insignia red matte enamel was then brushed onto the model straight out of the pot. This could be thinned, but I didn't feel the need to do this at this time. Again, care must be taken to only apply it in the correct areas. When the paint had dried, the masking tape was removed to reveal fairly neat red panels. There are a few areas where the paint has bled under the tape, and they will be covered up by the relevant colours later. Humbrol 135 satin varnish was thinned with water and then brushed over the entire model. This will form the base for the decals. A satin or gloss base will help prevent the decals from silvering when they are applied. With the varnish now dry, I removed the unneeded decals from the sheet, then placed the entire sheet into warm water. There aren't that many, so should complete this step quite quickly. The areas where the decals were going to be placed were given a coat of Humbrol Decal Fix. The decals were then slid off the backing paper into position and carefully manipulated if needed. A further coat of Decal Fix will help soften the decals into the surface and appear as though they are painted on. Pay attention to the decal placement instructions here, as some of them are applied on top of other ones, such as the large cross on the side of the fuselage, which has a smaller information label applied on top of it. With the decals in place, I touched up any areas of paint on the canopy which needed it. The radio mast was then glued into the hole in the top of the canopy using a general purpose glue. I used this glue to prevent the clear canopy from fogging up, which polycement can cause. Humbrol 49 matte varnish enamel was then thinned with a little white spirit and then applied over the entire model. This will help dull down the previous satin layer and give a uniform finish. It will also help protect all the decals and previous acrylic layers. Citadel non-oil acrylic wash was then applied to all the recessed details to help highlight them and make them stand out. The excess was then removed using a cotton bud soaked with acrylic thinners, brushing the wash away from the raised areas and leaving it in the recessed ones. Both Humbrol 135 satin and 49 matte acrylic varnishes were now mixed together. This will result in a semi-matte finish, but without the white residue that this kind of matte varnish can leave. It was thinned with water and brushed over the entire model. I did this as the previous Citadel wash can leave a slightly glossy finish, and I wanted to dull that down. The cockpit canopy can now be glued into place using the same general purpose glue from before. Take care here to avoid placing the glue in the wrong place and spoil the paint finish you have already achieved. Humbrol 53 gunmetal grey acrylic was applied to the barrels of the machine guns and engine exhausts using a fine brush. I then stretched a piece of sprue by heating it carefully with a lighter. Then as it began to melt, I pulled the two ends away from each other to produce a fine wire. This will be used to represent the aerial on top of the aircraft. I sanded away the paint from the aerial positions on the tail and mast. Then using Humbrol polycement, I placed small dots of glue on them. I'm using this cement here because it's thicker and a small amount won't run down the model and ruin the paint. The sprue was then carefully positioned, and when the cement had started to set, the excess was trimmed off. Humbrol 53 gunmetal grey painted onto the aerial will help to blend it into the model, and that's as far as I went with my build of the Airfix Messerschmitt BF109G-6 in 1/72 scale. I thought about doing further weathering, such as chipped paintwork and gun smoke stains, but I thought that because this was a Swiss aircraft in 1945, it probably wouldn't have seen much, if any, combat use. I therefore think that it might have been kept in a fairly good condition. So what do I think of this kit? I agree with Airfix, this is indeed a skill level 1 kit. It is really easy to assemble, even more so than some of the other level 1 kits in the range. The only difficult thing was the paint scheme. Not so much the red areas for the crosses or the camouflage, but more the mottling. This is definitely an area I need to practice on, to develop a hand brushing technique that might get good results, but I guess this is much easier to reproduce using an airbrush. I didn't have any issues with the assembly of this kit, but felt that the lack of a cockpit has let it down. Some of the details are not as fine as I would like them either, such as the landing gear legs and doors being a single moulding. So is it value for money? This kit was bought for me as a gift a couple of years ago and had been sitting in my stash until now. At the time it was £10 and you can still find it at that price online and in model shops. I don't think it's worth that price tag though, seeing as some of the more detailed Airfix kits are available for less in the £6 and £7 price range. My recommendation would be to get this kit if you can find it cheaper. Generally though, I found this to be a fun and enjoyable build, and have managed to get a good representation of the BF109G6 in an unusual and interesting paint scheme. As always, let me know what you think of my build and techniques in the comments below. Don't forget that I'm eager to hear any suggestions you might have for other kits or videos you would like to see, so feel free to post that too. All that's left to say is thanks for watching, and I'll see you all on the workbench again next time.